The air is cold. The sheets are coarse against your skin. A strange, unfamiliar weight presses on your chest. Not just the heaviness of the morning, but something deeper. You blink open your eyes, and the world before you isn't the one you know. A cracked ceiling above you, peeling wallpaper, the faint tick of an old clock. And then you see it, a mirror across the small room. You catch your reflection, the unmistakable combed-over hair, the sharp angular features. Panic grips you. You've woken up, as Adolf Hitler. But this is not a moment of political power or personal triumph. This is a cold reflection of military history. Decisions made, battles fought, and a war that consumed the world. Your thoughts drift back. It began in 1939, the invasion of Poland. You recall sitting in the Wolf's Lair, the military headquarters hidden deep in the forests of East Prussia. The plan was swift and overwhelming. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Fast-moving tanks, coordinated air assaults, and mechanized infantry striking before the enemy could react. Within weeks, Warsaw fell. The campaign had been executed almost flawlessly. On September 1st, 1939, the Wehrmacht moved in. Waves of Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, disrupting Polish supply lines and communications before ground forces even advanced. Armored panzer divisions, sleek and efficient, drove through enemy lines, cutting deep and fast, bypassing fortified positions to encircle the Polish forces. Within weeks, Warsaw fell. Your military leadership hailed it as a perfect example of modern mechanized warfare. Throughout the course of the war, your military ambition extended far beyond battlefield tactics. It reached into the realms of advanced technology and experimental weaponry. You spearheaded projects designed to create so-called wonder weapons, or Wunderwaffe, technological marvels that might turn the tide of war. Among them was the Maus super heavy tank, a behemoth of engineering weighing nearly 200 tons, the largest tank ever constructed. Though it was an impressive feat of armor and firepower, it was too heavy for practical deployment, unable to cross most bridges and far too slow to maneuver effectively on the battlefield. In the skies and across distant shores, you oversaw the development of revolutionary missile technology. The V-1 flying bomb, known as the Buzz Bomb, was one of history's first cruise missiles. Launched from hidden sites across occupied Europe, it brought destruction to British cities, though its limited accuracy and relatively slow speed made it vulnerable to interception. But more fearsome was the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It traveled faster than the speed of sound, striking its targets before any warning could be given. These rockets represented the future of warfare, a terrifying glimpse into a new era of long-range, high-speed attacks. And then there was the Schwerer Gustav, a railway gun of unprecedented size. A monstrous 80-centimeter caliber cannon capable of firing shells over 40 kilometers. Mounted on specially constructed railway tracks, it was deployed against fortress positions like Sevastopol, raining down destruction with shells that weighed over 7 tons each. Yet despite its raw power, the Gustav was slow to deploy and highly vulnerable to air attacks, limiting its effectiveness in the rapidly shifting theaters of modern war. In the end, while these technological marvels stunned the world with their scale and ambition, they arrived too late, or were too impractical, to change the outcome of the war. But their legacy would echo for decades in the technological advancements of post-war nations. The lessons learned from the First World War's stagnant trenches had been thrown aside. Mobility was king. The Blitzkrieg had proven its power, but even then, your mind moved to the west. Then came 1940, the Western Campaign, France, Belgium, the Low Countries. Again, Blitzkrieg tactics swept through Europe. The Manstein Plan was adopted, unexpected, unconventional. Attack through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies considered impassable for armored divisions. While their forces waited along the heavily fortified Maginot Line, your panzer units slipped through the dense forests and rough terrain, emerging behind enemy lines. The famed Ardennes forest, once thought impassable for tanks, became the pathway for the main assault. Within 6 weeks, Paris was under your control. It was a military maneuver that stunned the world. The Maginot Line, so heavily fortified, had been bypassed entirely. But even then, a critical decision loomed. The British Expeditionary Force cornered at Dunkirk. You remember standing over maps, debating whether to unleash the panzer divisions or hold them back. In the end, hesitation prevailed. Thousands of British troops escaped across the Channel. You turn your attention next to the skies. The Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched its offensive in July 1940. Thousands of bombers and fighters soared over the Channel. First, the focus was on RAF airfields and radar stations. But when British resistance held strong, frustration grew. The strategy shifted. London and other major cities were bombed in what would become known as the Blitz, a purely strategic campaign to dominate the air and prepare for a possible invasion across the English Channel, Operation Sea Lion. Yet this battle didn't go as planned. The Royal Air Force proved resilient, and your Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses. The skies over Britain never fell under your control. Then, 1941, the greatest gamble of all, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. You remember the grand vision, 3 massive army groups sweeping through the vast Russian front, north to Leningrad, center to Moscow, south to the oil-rich Caucasus. The date was June 22nd, 1941. Over 3 million soldiers crossed the Soviet border, the largest invasion force in history. In your mind, it was a strike not just against an enemy, but against winter itself. Victory had to be swift before the harsh Russian cold returned. At first, victory seemed certain. The Red Army was caught by surprise. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners, vast swathes of territory captured. But then, the Russian winter. Unrelenting cold, stretched supply lines, and the stubborn resistance of Soviet forces. Moscow held. It held. Strategic miscalculations began to mount. You recall the critical debates with your generals. Some urged a focused attack on Moscow, others on the southern oil fields. In the end, indecision fractured the campaign's momentum. By early 1942, your focus shifted south, Stalingrad, a city that became a symbol of stubborn defense. What began as a tactical objective turned into a brutal urban battle. Your armies became trapped, encircled by Soviet forces during the harshest winter. You think back to General Paulus, left without support. He surrendered in early 1943. It was a devastating blow. Now the tide had turned. Your mind shifts to another front, the sands of North Africa. While the Eastern Front consumed vast resources, the fight for the Mediterranean raged on. You had high hopes for the Africa Corps, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. A brilliant tactician, Rommel brought mobility and daring to the endless dunes of Libya and Egypt. His initial campaigns were dazzling. With smaller forces, he outmaneuvered the British repeatedly, pushing them back across vast distances. Tobruk fell, and at one point, the Africa Corps stood poised on the doorstep of Alexandria. But you also remember the frustrations. Supplies were always the limiting factor. The Royal Navy controlled the Mediterranean, and convoys struggled to deliver fuel and munitions across the sea. Without supplies, even the finest tanks became nothing more than immobile hulks in the desert. By late 1942, the tide turned again. The British 8th Army, under General Montgomery, launched a massive counter-offensive at El Alamein. At the same time, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch, opening yet another front. Rommel, ever the realist, pleaded for a strategic withdrawal. But you insisted, hold the line, fight on. orders that became increasingly disconnected from the harsh realities on the ground. From that point forward, you fought a war on two fronts. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps under General Rommel attempted to seize control of strategic territories, but stretched resources and Allied resistance pushed them back. Your final strategic hope came with the Ardennes offensive. What history would call the Battle of the Bulge. A bold, last-ditch attempt to split the Allied forces and capture Antwerp. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The surprise attack caught the Allies off guard, but their superior logistics and air power soon turned the tide. And then, the winter. You recall the brutal cold settling over the Eastern Front, temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius. German tanks froze solid, engines seized up. Soldiers wrapped their feet in paper and scraps of fabric, their boots long deteriorated. Supplies couldn't reach the front. Yet still, you pushed forward. Moscow was within reach, barely 20 kilometers away. The capital lay under siege, but the Soviet resistance stiffened. General Zhukov counterattacked with fresh Siberian divisions, perfectly trained and equipped for winter warfare. That moment, standing over the maps, feeling the bitter draft even in your headquarters, you must have felt it. For the first time, the creeping certainty that victory might not come. Not here, not in the East. And yet, you refused to retreat. You ordered your forces to hold their positions, to stand their ground despite the impossible conditions. A decision made as much from pride as from military doctrine. The Eastern Front had become a war of attrition, a struggle against not just the Red Army, but the elements, the landscape, and the very limits of human endurance. Now, standing here in the final days of April 1945, you review the map one last time. Germany's borders have shrunk to a shadow of their former reach. The Red Army closes in from the east, the Western Allies from the west. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, you feel the mind of a strategist still working, analyzing, considering movements, pondering whether a different decision here or there might have changed the outcome. History will study these campaigns, the brilliant tactics and the critical failures. Even as the Eastern Front crumbled, you still believed that the West could be held. You trusted in the Atlantic Wall, a sprawling system of fortifications stretching from Norway to the south of France. Concrete bunkers, coastal artillery, minefields, and tank traps lined the shores. And yet, on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. You had anticipated an attack, but not at Normandy. Your commanders believed the main strike would come at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing from Britain. So you held your reserves back, waiting for the real invasion. But the real invasion had already begun. Thousands of Allied troops stormed the beaches under a hail of artillery and machine gun fire. Despite the heavy fortifications, despite the bravery of the defenders, the sheer force of the Allied assault overwhelmed your positions. You remember the frantic phone calls, the desperate orders to mobilize panzer divisions. But confusion reigned. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Allies had established a secure foothold. Within weeks, they were pushing inland. Paris was liberated by August. The Western Front collapsed far more rapidly than anyone had predicted. In the winter of 1944, you made one final strategic gamble. One last attempt to reverse the course of the war. The Ardennes offensive, known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge. A massive surprise attack through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal, split the Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. In the freezing fog of December, German tanks rolled through the Ardennes, catching the Allies off guard. American units were encircled at Bastogne, supply lines were threatened, and chaos erupted among the Allied ranks. You felt a familiar thrill, the exhilaration of the blitzkrieg, the echo of earlier victories. But this time, it was fleeting. The Allies recovered quickly. Clear skies returned, and with them, the overwhelming power of Allied air forces. Fuel shortages crippled your armored divisions. Without air superiority and with dwindling resources, the offensive ground to a halt. The bulge in the Allied lines was pushed back. It had been your last major offensive, but for now, you sit quietly, staring at the fading maps, the cracked walls of the bunker, and the distant sound of artillery above. The war is nearly over. The world is already moving on. If you've enjoyed this, don't forget to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. If you have ideas for other historical characters, let me know down in the comments below. Let's continue. The world didn't fall into darkness all at once. It began with a low rumble, a faint tremor beneath the fragile surface of uneasy peace. In the grand halls of diplomacy, leaders exchanged forced smiles. Treaties, meant to hold the world together, dried on brittle paper already cracked with suspicion. And behind closed doors, the engines of war began to stir. The roots of this conflict stretched back decades. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated and economically crippled. Across Europe, economies teetered on the brink of collapse. In America, the stock market crash of 1929 plunged the world into a Great Depression. As hardship spread, extremist ideologies found fertile ground. Germany, under Adolf Hitler's National Socialist regime, rebuilt its military in secret, violating the treaty it had signed. Italy, under Mussolini, dreamed of a new Roman Empire. Japan, hungry for resources, invaded Manchuria in 1931 and later China in 1937. The League of Nations, powerless and indecisive, watched from the sidelines. By 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss and then set his sights on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, eager to avoid war, declared peace for our time after signing the Munich Agreement. But peace was an illusion. On September 1st, 1939, the storm broke. The morning sun rose over the Polish countryside, casting golden light across rolling fields and sleepy villages. And then, the sky fell. German panzers burst across the borders in a thunderous assault. Their tracks ripped through the earth, followed by infantry moving with terrifying precision. Overhead, Stuka dive bombers screamed, their sirens howling as bombs rained from the sky. In just weeks, Poland was crushed. From the east, the Soviet Union invaded under the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Britain and France declared war, but their armies waited behind their defensive lines, hesitant to strike. This eerie stalemate became known as the phony war. But in Finland, winter roared to life. The Soviet Union attacked Finland in November 1939. Outnumbered and under-equipped, Finnish forces fought like shadows in the snow, blending into the icy forests. Though they ultimately conceded territory, their fierce resistance shocked the world. Spring came, and with it the true fury of war. In April 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a day. Norway fought longer but was overwhelmed. By May, the German blitzkrieg turned westward. Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg were swept aside. France, confident behind the Maginot Line, was bypassed through the Ardennes forest, a region thought impassable to tanks. Within 6 weeks, Paris had fallen. France was humiliated, divided between occupation and the puppet Vichy government. At Dunkirk, Allied forces were cornered. But in one of the war's most remarkable moments, a ragtag flotilla of fishing boats, merchant vessels and warships crossed the channel under enemy fire. Over 338,000 soldiers were evacuated. A defeat turned into a miracle of survival. Now Britain stood alone. The summer of 1940 saw the Battle of Britain rage in the skies. The German Luftwaffe launched relentless bombing raids. London burned under the Blitz, but the Royal Air Force, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with extraordinary courage. In cockpits barely big enough for a grown man, British pilots soared into the chaos. Spitfires and Hurricanes raced against time, defending their homeland. And when the smoke cleared, Britain still stood. Hitler abandoned his plans for invasion. But far across the globe, another empire moved. Japan, already entrenched in China, sought to dominate the Pacific. Their eyes turned toward the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. But first, they needed to cripple American naval power. On December 7th, 1941, the skies above Pearl Harbor darkened with Japanese aircraft. Battleships burned. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives. By morning, the United States was at war. In Europe, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, against the Soviet Union in June 1941. Over 3 million German soldiers swept across the border, catching Soviet forces by surprise. Cities fell like dominoes: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. By December, German troops stood at the gates of Moscow. But then winter came. The temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees. German engines froze. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspapers and rags. The Red Army counterattacked with fresh Siberian divisions. The Germans faltered. The year began under dark skies. Across Europe, the sounds of war echoed relentlessly. Snow blanketed the Eastern Front, muffling the screams of battle and the crunch of frostbitten soldiers' boots. Yet even in the darkest corners of the world, a shift had begun. 1943 would be the year the war changed course, the year the tide turned. In the East, the once invincible German war machine had stalled. For months, the Wehrmacht had been locked in a brutal struggle for the city of Stalingrad. The name itself had become a symbol of defiance. What was meant to be a quick victory turned into a slow, agonizing death for the German Sixth Army. The ruins of Stalingrad were a twisted labyrinth of shattered stone and smoke. Soviet snipers haunted every corner, their rifles hidden among the rubble. Day after day, the German soldiers fought for mere feet of ground, their bodies frozen and starving as the cruel Russian winter closed its iron grip. In January 1943, it finally ended. Encircled and out of supplies, General Friedrich Paulus defied the direct orders of Hitler and surrendered what was left of his once proud army. Over 90,000 German soldiers marched into captivity, their heads bowed against the bitter wind. It was a defeat that sent shockwaves across the Axis powers. For the first time since the war began, the German forces had suffered a catastrophic and undeniable loss. But the Eastern Front wasn't the only place where the war had turned against the Axis. In North Africa, the sun-scorched deserts became the stage for a different kind of battle. The once dominant Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been forced to retreat. British forces, led by General Bernard Montgomery, had secured a critical victory at El Alamein in late 1942, and now the Americans had arrived, eager and determined. From the west, the American and British forces launched Operation Torch, landing in Morocco and Algeria. Together, they squeezed the Axis forces like a vice. Throughout early 1943, fierce battles raged across the sands. The Germans, short on fuel and reinforcements, could no longer hold their ground. By May, the North African campaign was over. The last Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. For the first time in the war, an entire German army group had been completely destroyed on the African continent. But while the desert fell silent, new plans were already in motion. In July 1943, the Allies set their sights on Europe's soft underbelly, the Italian peninsula. It began with the invasion of Sicily. Under Operation Husky, Allied forces stormed the island's rocky beaches under the cover of night. American paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, their parachutes billowing silently in the dark. British and Canadian forces fought through narrow mountain passes, village by village. The defenders, German soldiers and their Italian allies, fought fiercely, but they were outmatched. By mid-August, Sicily had fallen. And then came a moment that stunned the world. In the face of relentless Allied pressure and growing internal dissent, the Italian people turned against their fascist dictator. Benito Mussolini, who had ruled Italy with an iron fist for over 2 decades, was arrested on the orders of the king. The streets of Rome filled with celebration as the man who once promised a new Roman Empire was dragged away in disgrace. But the war in Italy was far from over. Despite Mussolini's fall, the Germans poured reinforcements into the peninsula. The terrain was treacherous: steep mountains, narrow valleys, and heavily fortified defensive lines. When Allied forces landed at Salerno in September, they faced a wall of German artillery. The Italian campaign became a slow, grinding advance through mud, stone, and blood. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the largest tank battle in human history unfolded. At Kursk, in the summer of 1943, nearly 3 million men and 6,000 tanks clashed across the burning fields. The Germans launched Operation Citadel, a desperate attempt to regain control of the Eastern Front, but the Soviets, well prepared and heavily fortified, were waiting. Tiger tanks and Panther tanks rumbled into the fields, their thick armor and massive guns unleashing destruction. But the Soviet T-34s, smaller and faster, struck back with equal ferocity. The air above was a battlefield of its own, with thousands of aircraft dueling for dominance. The Battle of Kursk ended in yet another devastating German defeat. It was the last time Hitler would attempt a major offensive in the east. From that point on, the Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Germany. Across the Atlantic, 1943 was also the year the Battle of the Atlantic reached its climax. German U-boats had long prowled the seas, cutting off vital supply lines and sinking thousands of tons of Allied shipping. But by mid-1943, Allied convoys sailed under the watchful protection of new technologies: radar, sonar, and long-range aircraft that turned the hunters into the hunted. U-boat losses mounted. The wolf packs were broken. The lifeline between America and Europe was secured. As the year drew to a close, the leaders of the Allied world gathered for the first time. In November, in the city of Tehran, Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill met face to face. There, amidst the grand halls and the guarded whispers, plans for the final victory took shape. Together, they agreed to open a second front in Europe, what would become the D-Day invasion of Normandy in 1944. And so, as 1943 ended, the winds of war had shifted. The Axis, once unstoppable, now stood on the defensive across every front. The Allies, united and determined, had clawed their way back from the brink. Victory was still far off, and the road ahead was paved with unimaginable sacrifice. But for the first time in years, hope burned brighter than fear. By May 1943, the North African campaign was over. The Eastern Front became a grinding machine of attrition. Nowhere was this more brutal than the city of Stalingrad. The battle raged from street to street, house to house. Soviet snipers haunted the rubble. Artillery turned entire districts to dust. In November 1942, Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army. Trapped in the ruins of the city, starving and freezing, they fought to the bitter end. By February 1943, the Germans surrendered. Over 90,000 soldiers were marched into captivity. Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war in the East. In the Pacific, American forces began their island-hopping campaign. The jungles of Guadalcanal, the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, the deadly cliffs of Okinawa, all became battlegrounds. Each island was a fortress. Every inch was bought with blood. And then came D-Day. The year 1944 began with the roar of engines and the clatter of steel against ice. Across the vast Eastern Front, Soviet artillery thundered relentlessly, rolling back the exhausted German armies that had once seemed unstoppable. In the west, the Allies prepared for a gamble unlike any before, a strike that would carve a path directly into the heart of occupied Europe. It was the year the war accelerated toward its conclusion, the year when the cost of victory grew higher, but the promise of peace came into sight. In January, the Soviets launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. For 900 harrowing days, Leningrad had endured siege and starvation. Now the Red Army broke the German stranglehold. Soviet forces pushed westward with unrelenting fury, recapturing swaths of Ukraine and Belarus. Cities once reduced to rubble echoed again with the sounds of liberation. But it was in the west that the eyes of the world turned in June. For months, Allied leaders had planned the largest amphibious invasion in human history, Operation Overlord. The target, the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy, France. On June 6, 1944, under a steel-grey sky and crashing surf, the invasion began. Dawn broke over the English Channel, revealing a horizon packed with thousands of Allied ships. The sea itself seemed alive with movement. At precisely 6:30 a.m., American forces landed on Omaha and Utah beaches. British and Canadian divisions struck at Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Omaha, the landing met with disaster. German machine guns poured relentless fire down on the beaches from fortified bunkers perched high above the cliffs. The sea turned red. Equipment sank under the weight of the waves, and soldiers scrambled desperately for cover among the metal obstacles and shattered bodies. But inch by inch, against impossible odds, the Allies advanced. By the end of that longest day, over 150,000 Allied troops had secured a foothold in France. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. From the beaches of Normandy, the Allies surged forward. Town by town, they liberated France from the iron grip of occupation. Paris, the city of light, rose in rebellion against its oppressors. On August 25th, Allied tanks rolled through the streets as crowds poured out to welcome them. French resistance fighters stood side by side with the soldiers of the Free French forces under General Charles de Gaulle. Paris was free again. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front continued to burn. In the summer of 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, one of the most devastating offensives of the entire war. Over 2.5 million Soviet troops smashed through German Army Group Center. Within weeks, entire German divisions were wiped out. By September, the Red Army was at the gates of Warsaw. In the Pacific, the Allies pressed their advantage. The island-hopping campaign surged forward. On the volcanic island of Saipan, brutal fighting raged through jungles and caves. American forces endured suicidal charges and fierce resistance. With the fall of Saipan in July, the American B-29 bombers were now within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. At sea, the Battle of the Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a decisive victory, American carrier-based aircraft decimated Japanese naval air power, shooting down hundreds of enemy planes. As summer faded into autumn, a bold and risky plan unfolded in the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden. British and American paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, their parachutes billowing like ghostly flowers against the morning sky. Their objective was to seize key bridges across the Rhine and punch a hole into Germany's industrial heartland. But the operation faltered at Arnhem. The paratroopers found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and cut off. Despite extraordinary bravery, the famous words rang out over the radio. "I'm afraid it's been a bridge too far." As winter approached, everyone believed the Germans were finally on the brink of collapse. But in December 1944, under a blanket of fog and snow, Hitler launched a final, desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. It was a gamble designed to split the Allied forces and seize the critical port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge began. German panzers surged through the snowy woods, smashing through thin American defensive lines. In the town of Bastogne, American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne held fast, surrounded and outnumbered. When the German commander demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. With the skies clearing and Allied reinforcements arriving, the German offensive crumbled. By the final days of 1944, the road to Berlin lay open. The Reich was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, its factories bombed, its armies broken, and its cities in ruins. But the war was not yet over, and the worst was still to come. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel. Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The beaches became killing fields. Machine guns raked the sand. Artillery lit the sky. But by nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. From the west, Allied forces pushed toward Paris. From the east, the Red Army crushed German defenses. In December 1944, Germany launched a final desperate counterattack, the Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. German tanks rolled through the snowy forests of Belgium. The Allies were caught off guard, but the American defense at Bastogne held firm. Slowly, the German offensive collapsed. By spring 1945, Allied forces stood on the banks of the Rhine. Berlin was encircled. The world stood on the edge of both triumph and ruin as the calendar turned to 1945. Across continents and oceans, the sounds of war echoed through shattered cities and blood-soaked fields. But this year would be different. This year, after 6 long years of conflict, the guns would finally fall silent. Yet, before peace could come, the war would reach its most brutal, desperate phase. In the frozen forests of Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge still raged in the early days of January. Hitler's last gamble had sent German tanks crashing through the Ardennes, catching the Allies off guard. For weeks, American forces fought in snow-covered foxholes, their breath freezing in the bitter cold. At Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne stood surrounded and defiant. Their supplies dwindled, their casualties rose, but they held firm. When German commanders demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe responded with a single, unforgettable word: nuts. By late January, the skies cleared, Allied air power returned, and the German offensive collapsed. From that point on, Germany's fate was sealed. In the east, the Soviet juggernaut roared to life with overwhelming force. On January 12th, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. Soviet forces, numbering in the millions, crashed through German defenses in Poland. City after city fell. Warsaw was liberated, and by the end of the month, Soviet tanks were just 70 kilometers from Berlin. The German homeland, once protected by distance and fortified lines, was now exposed to the fury it had unleashed across Europe. Meanwhile, the Western Allies pressed forward. British, American, and French forces crossed the Rhine in March, sweeping through the industrial heartland of Germany. Bridges that had once been thought impregnable, like the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, fell into Allied hands. German resistance grew more fanatical as the Allies advanced. Boys no older than 15 were pulled from schools and sent to the front lines. Elderly men, once too old for military service, now carried outdated rifles, ordered to defend their collapsing nation. But it was a losing fight. Allied bombers darkened the skies over Germany's cities. Dresden burned under a storm of firebombs in February. In a matter of hours, one of Germany's most beautiful cities was reduced to ash and rubble. By April, the Allies stood at the gates of Berlin. In the Pacific, the final, bloodiest battles were yet to be fought. On the island of Iwo Jima, US Marines stormed black volcanic sands under a hail of machine gun fire and artillery. The Japanese defenders, hidden deep in underground tunnels and bunkers, fought with the determination of men who knew they would not leave the island alive. For over a month, the battle raged. The image of American soldiers raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became a symbol of both victory and sacrifice. But that victory had come at a terrible price. Next came Okinawa. The battle began in April and lasted nearly 3 months. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese forces fought with everything they had. Kamikaze pilots filled the skies, crashing their planes into Allied ships with deadly precision. On the beaches and in the hills, the fighting was savage. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers fought to the death, and thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire or driven to despair. As the Allies prepared for a possible invasion of Japan itself, the cost of victory weighed heavily on every commander's mind. An invasion would mean millions more lives lost. Back in Europe, the end had come. On April 16th, the Soviets launched their final assault on Berlin. The city was already a ruin, its streets choked with rubble, its people living in bombed-out cellars. Yet the fighting was fierce and desperate. House by house, street by street, the Red Army advanced. In his underground bunker beneath the shattered capital, Adolf Hitler made his final decisions. On April 30th, as Soviet troops closed in, he ended his life. 1 week later, on May 7th, Germany officially surrendered. The long night of war in Europe was over. Crowds flooded into the streets of London, New York, Paris, and Moscow. Flags waved, champagne corks flew, and strangers embraced in the streets. On May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, was celebrated around the world. But in the Pacific, the war ground on. The cost of Okinawa had shown Allied leaders the terrible reality of a land invasion of Japan. Facing the prospect of countless more lives lost, a decision was made that would forever change the world. On August 6, 1945, a lone American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, soared over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare was dropped. In a blinding flash of light and heat, the city was obliterated. Tens of thousands perished instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from injuries and radiation in the days and weeks to come. Still, Japan did not surrender. On August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Finally, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. In a solemn broadcast, he announced Japan's surrender. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender was signed. The Second World War was over. But the cost of victory had been unimaginable. Over 70 million lives were lost. Great cities lay in ruin. Families across every nation mourned loved ones who would never return. And yet, from the ashes of destruction, hope was born. The United Nations was founded, built on a simple, powerful promise that the horrors of global war would never again be repeated. And as 1945 drew to a close, the world looked to the future, scarred, humbled, but still standing. On May 7th, Germany unconditionally surrendered. In Times Square and Trafalgar Square, in the streets of Moscow and Paris, the world celebrated. But the war was not yet over. In the Pacific, the battles grew bloodier. At Iwo Jima, US Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. At Okinawa, nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Faced with the prospect of invading Japan itself, a campaign that would have cost millions of lives, the United States made a fateful decision. In August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was beyond comprehension. On September 2nd, Japan officially surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. The Second World War was finally over. But the cost was almost too great to bear. Thanks for listening. Until next time, friends.